Heather Morris. Heather was born in New Zealand and is now living in Australia, and she's an international #1 best-selling author who is passionate about stories of survival, resilience, and hope. In 2003, when she was working in a large public hospital in Melbourne, Heather was introduced to an elderly gentleman who might have a story worth telling. The day she met Lali Sokolov changed both their lives. Heather used Lali's story as the basis for The Tattooist of Auschwitz, which sold 6 million copies. Her follow-up novel, Silka's Journey, has sold more than 1 million copies worldwide. Heather's first nonfiction book, Stories of Hope, was published last September. And today we will talk about her latest book, Three Sisters, which was just published last month. And a little bit about the book, Three Sisters, for those of you who may not have had the opportunity to read the book, which was inspired by a true story. The story of 3 Slovakian sisters who survived years of imprisonment in the most notorious death camp, Auschwitz. Livia, Magda, and Sibi clung together and nearly died of starvation. But when the Allies closed in, they had one last hurdle to face, the death march from Auschwitz, as the Nazis tried to erase any evidence of the prisoners and what had gone on there. And due to a last-minute stroke of luck, the 3 of them were able to escape formation and hide in the woods until they were able to be saved. And then the story begins. When the war ends, the sisters wander through Germany and return to find squatters in their home and glaring anti-Semitism all around there. After a harrowing journey to Israel in 1948, the narrative continues with their new life as survivors, and they build families while often struggling with their emotional wounds. And they build families while often struggling with their emotional wounds. They must face the ghosts of their past and the secrets that they might have kept from each other to find true peace and happiness. So let me throw it back to Heather. We're so excited to see you this evening.
Thank you very much. And thank you to everyone who's taking the time out of, I know what is a very busy period of the year, to listen to me talk about this incredible story that I've written. It's been published just last month. By the way, let me just back up a little bit. Elisa mentioned the book, Stories of Hope. It has not been released in the US yet, but it will be. It's being released there at the middle of next year. My American publishers, they wanted to just focus on me being a fiction writer, because this is a non-fiction book. You get to know a little bit about me, not too much, so don't get carried away. That's what Stories of Hope is about. Well, I didn't tell you anything, really, did I? But let's go back to the 3 sisters and how I got to tell this incredible story. I'm so lucky that with each of my books, I have a story behind the story. And that starts with how I got it in the first place. I'm very clear, they may be my books, but they are not my stories. None of them are my stories. They belong to others who've just entrusted me to be able to share them with you. When I met Lali Sokolov in 2003, you heard Elisa say that our meeting changed both our lives. How did it change his life? Let me just sort of answer that bit. I think sometimes I forget to. He was 87 years of age and he'd just lost his wife of over 6 decades. To him, he didn't want to be with me. He wanted to be with Gita. And he would tell me that every time I went to see him for months. Hurry up and tell my story. I need to be with Gita. The change in his life came about when he gradually got to know me, trust me, and then decided to reconnect with the Jewish community in Melbourne and wanted to no longer say those words to me, I need to be with Gita. He wanted to live. And he did for another 3 years. Lali had told me not only his story, which I knew him for 3 years. I wrote his story as a screenplay. Oh, by the way, we didn't say anything, but anyone who wants to ask a question, sort of just speak up and you'll appear on my screen and we can talk away. I wrote his story as a screenplay. He did not get to read the novel. He read many drafts of the screenplay. And that novel was my adaptation of my own screenplay. So it is one and the same. He told me about not only he and Gita, but about Silka. You must tell the world, he would say, wagging his finger, about the bravest person Another wag of the finger, not the bravest girl, the bravest person I ever knew. She saved my life and we would not be together without her. Now, writing Silke's story was very different because Silke died back in 2004. I got her story from Lali. I got it from Gita. Gita had made a show, a videotape where she talked about her. I was privileged to meet many other Holocaust survivors in Australia and now globally as well, many of whom knew of Silke. I was then able to research using professional researchers in Russia, in Moscow, give me all the information about the gulag she was in. So her book was written by my speaking to survivors, from Lali, of course, because by the way, his wife Gita and Silke kept in touch for decades. Gita went to Slovakia and used to stay with her. And there's the link then again to the three sisters. But then I went into Slovakia myself and I sat for hours with friends and neighbors of Silke to hear firsthand about this incredible woman and how she had survived and become this beautiful woman who was so loving and so loved. So there's the background in case any of you don't know the other two stories and how they link. Now let's move on to Three Sisters. I was in South Africa 2 years ago. I was there at a book festival. It's in a town called Franschhoek. Many of you know it. It's just outside of Cape Town. And it happens to be the wine region of South Africa. For me, that had the added bonus of going to a book festival that's set in a wine region. Who's going to say no? Well, I got back from from events and being out one night. It was early hours of the morning, about 2 in the morning. And I wasn't sleepy, which probably told me I actually hadn't drunk as much wine as I thought I had. However, I opened up my computer and I read an email. It was from a man who lives in Toronto in Canada. His writing to me, I now have to tell you why he could write to me. The Tattooist of Auschwitz has got a very different cover in Australia than you know in the US. Unfortunately, I don't even have one up behind me. That's bad of me. It is a black background, 2 arms from the elbow down coming to meet at the hands, and the tattooed numbers of Lali and Gita on the arms. Canada and Brazil were the only 2 countries out of the 57 countries that have taken that book to take the Australian cover. And if they hadn't, there's a good chance I wouldn't be talking to you today. Because this man who lives in Canada picked up a copy of The Tattooist at the airport in Toronto, flying to see his mother in Tel Aviv. The next day, he left it on her coffee table, intending to finish reading it. His 93-year-old mother then walked past, looked down at the cover, and simply said to him, "That must be about Lali and Gita." And when he said, "How could you possibly know that?" She said, "Well, it's simple. Look at the number on the girl's arm on the cover. Now look at the number on my arm. They're 3 apart. Your Auntie Sibby's was 2 apart. We were standing behind Gita when Lali tattooed all of us. We went to school with Gita. We're on the train going to Auschwitz with Gita. We shared block 21 with Gita. You don't remember Gita. She came to Israel and stayed with your Aunt Magda several times when you were a boy." You read an email like that, even if it is 2 o'clock in the morning, there's no more sleeping being done. I immediately wrote back, and over the next 24, 48 hours, many emails passed between us. And then I got an email saying that his mum wanted to talk to me and could I possibly phone her? And so I did. I phoned her from Cape Town. And this beautiful 93-year-old wanted to tell me about Lali and Gita. And then she said, "There's so much I can tell you about that time, but I don't like talking on the telephone. Can you come and see me?" Well, Israel's not exactly next door to South Africa. It's probably closer than Australia was. So I said, yeah, I'd come and see her. Got in touch with my publishers in London and said, "Look, I need to go to Israel at some point. I really want to meet this woman." Even though the book was written, she wanted to talk to me about it. And I'm up for that. I'm good for that. My publishers said, they wrote me back about 24 hours later and said, "You know how you're meant to be going home from Johannesburg tomorrow back to Melbourne?" And I went, "Uh-huh." They said, "Well, you're not. We're rerouting you straight to Tel Aviv." You know, I remember saying to Kate, my publisher, Kate, I can't possibly go to Israel. I've got to go home tomorrow. And she said, why? I can see your schedule. I know you've got nothing you have to race home for. I said, yeah, but Kate, I've run out of clean knickers. I've timed it to be able to get back to Australia and do my washing. Well, she promptly told me to go shopping or learn how to wash, but I was going to Tel Aviv the next day. And I did. And I walked into the apartment and into the arms of 93-year-old Livy, her son Odie and his wife, who live in Canada. And then within days, Magda and her daughters and the adult grandchildren, the great-grandchildren. Sibi, the eldest sister, she died in 2015. Her two sons and their wives and their children and their grandchildren, all of whom over the next 3 or 4 days came to meet me and talk to me. And at that point, it was just meeting this crazy lady who'd flown from Johannesburg, who lives in Australia, who knew somebody that they knew. But in amongst it all, I was hearing the sister's story. And I said to them one day, I went, I really think you need to find a ghostwriter here in Israel to record your story. It is extraordinary. It needs to be recorded. Then one of them piped up and said, have you been to Jerusalem? I said, no. And they said, oh, well, why don't you go there tomorrow? I said, well, I can't really, it's too far away. They all kind of looked at me and chortled. You know what it's like. We live in big countries, right? You just don't say to somebody, hey, you live in California, well, you want to be in Atlanta tomorrow, just nip on down and we'll see you when you get back that night. When they pointed out to me it was just 40 minutes down the road, I no longer had an excuse not to go to Jerusalem. I did not know that what they were wanting to do was get me out of the house. I did spend an amazing day in Jerusalem, many, many hours at Yad Vashem, being welcomed there by the historians and the people who run that incredible facility and showing me things behind the scenes. And of course, walking around Old Town Jerusalem, and I had a great time. The next day when I got back, there was a family gathering. And they told me that in my absence, they had all got together and decided they would ask me if I would write the story of the sisters. That was how I got presented with this incredible opportunity. So I was there for a few more days and started getting more and more of the stories. Luckily, both Livy and Sibi, now Livy, she was 15 when taken to Auschwitz. Sibi was 19. She was the eldest. Magda was 17. She did not go to Auschwitz in April 1942. So this story that I had written, for a great chunk of it, has the dual narrative of these sisters being separated. And I'll explain in the middle the significance of what that separation meant to them. Livy and Sibi had made shower tapes 25, 30 years ago. And so I was able to get copies of them. So how do I get the story? From the shower tapes of Sibi, from their families, from the adult children, the grandchildren, adult grandchildren, and of course these two incredible surviving sisters. They're now 95 and 97, Livy and Magda, still living in their own apartments in Tel Aviv, or the suburbs of Tel Aviv, and still doing beautiful. And I communicate with them every other day and their family. This story, I'm going to tell you roughly or briefly what it's about. And, you know, I don't mind giving you some spoilers here. It's not going to detract from you reading it, but it's going to explain not only the genesis of the story and how I wrote it, it's going to explain why I write in a style that's called fiction. How can I say it's fiction? And then on the other hand, say this is a true story. If you have any doubts and you pick up the book, before you read page 1, while you're still standing in the bookshop or in your library, flick to the back, start at the back of this book. Look at the photos of these 3 incredible sisters and their families. There's a whole lot of them there, from when they were little girls, to teenagers, to brides, to mothers, to old women. And you will see their photos, and you will read letters also from several of the children, and one from Livy addressed to me and published in the book. But what's the story about? Well, you kind of got a little bit of it, haven't you? It's a Holocaust story. And it's not. It is and it isn't. Of course, it's centered around the Holocaust. But it begins back in Slovakia when those girls were little girls, 3, 5, and 7. They made a promise to their father. He made them promise one day that they would stay together, that they would never let anything separate them. They were strongest together. Livy reckons that she remembers that promise. She was 3, of course she doesn't. But what she remembers is her 2 older sisters reminding her of it every day of their lives. Remember our promise to Papa. The significance of the day they made that promise. And here's the spoiler in the first 2 or 3 pages. They could not know, those little girls, that their father would die the next day. He knew that there was a possibility because he was undergoing life-threatening surgery, which is why he did that on that day. Now I'm going to tell you about my style of writing because it ties in to what I've just told you, how I fictionalize or how I reimagine the storylines, the vignettes, all the little bits that these girls have shared with me. And this is a good example of how I do that. When I'm told this by Livy and Magda, and I say to them, and given that they stayed living in that house until Livy was 15 for another 12 years, I said to them, what can you remember about it? And Livy says, nothing. And Magda goes, well, not much. We just know that we did. So how can I tell that storyline? I said, tell me about the house that you lived in, your home. And they describe a very modest 1-bedroom house with their grandfather sleeping in what they called the broom closet and a little kitchen living area. So they described the interior of their home to me. And then and I'm going, okay, well, I can work with that. But then Magda piped up. And given that Magda mostly speaks Hebrew, by the way, so I'm having to get interpreters with her. Livy speaks good English, but Magda understands me. And then she said, Livy, remember the oleander bush in the backyard? It kept wanting to die and Mama wouldn't let it. And the girls started giggling. You know, every year, every winter, that oleander tree wanted to die. And Mama kept saying, I'm not going to let you. And then Livy piped up, and the gate, remember the gate in the back fence that never got fixed. So whenever the wind was blowing, it would bang, and it used to frighten me at night. I now have 2 potential settings that I can place that conversation with their father in. Inside the home, outside in the backyard. I reimagined it outside in that backyard, sitting beside that oleander bush. So that is what my fictionalizing of telling a story is about, and that's what the entire book is like. I have taken their stories and then created them. This promise was made, as I said, when they were girls. And so when they were separated in 1942 in April, they were separated because Magda was in hospital. She wasn't overly sick, but a very well-meaning Christian doctor who had come to see her knew that young boys and girls in Slovakia were being taken away to work for the Germans. And he persuaded her mother, let me put her in hospital, she may be safe. Sibi was off in the forest outside of Branov where they lived. She was there Hashara training because she wanted to leave and go to the promised land, to go to Palestine. So she wasn't home. Magda got put in hospital. Surely 15-year-old Livy would be safe. No, she wasn't. Magda's in hospital. Sibi comes home the day before Livy has got to report at a designated time and place. By the way, always Friday evenings. They were always so cruel about turning up to round people up, knowing that they would be home for Shabbat. Sibi said, I'm going with her. Her name wasn't on the list, and she did. So that's why the 2 girls went in April 1942. Now, I probably don't have to tell you because you know it more than a lot of audiences I have, but the Slovakian boys and girls, young men and women, were the first Jewish people taken into Auschwitz. Their country was the first to hand them over. I've done a lot of research into how they survived for nearly 3 years, the Slovakian Jewish boys and girls. Lali and Gita, Slovakian, Silka, Slovakian. I know several other Slovakian survivors here in Australia. And they were there the longest. And I think that in some ways helped them because they were there the longest. They got, that's a terrible word to use, acclimatized, but they got used to the life that they were being forced to lead. And they also, of course, got to witness way more than they ever should have. But they were there, those two girls, from that period of time, beginning of April, 9th of April. But they then got reunited 2.5 years later when the Nazis finally caught up with Magda. She was back in Slovakia with her mother and grandfather every Friday afternoon, having to leave the house. Every Friday early evening, the Hlinka guards came round and knocked on their door and said to their mother, "Where is Magda?" And they could say she's not here. And if they burst in and searched the place, she was not there. She was either hiding out in the forest nearby or a well-meaning neighbour across the road from them, who, by the way, I identify in the book because Magda remembers her name. She would hide her in her ceiling. There were a few times the Hlinka guards went over there and would say to her, "Are you hiding, Magda?" And this beautiful woman would just say, "I don't know what you're talking about." And they would occasionally search the house, but she was hidden in the ceiling. But they then found each other 2.5 years later when Magda found herself in Birkenau. She did not know her sisters were there, could not know that. That god-awful place, which I'm sure many of you have been to, where you can't see where it begins and ends, where you're trapped into your little areas, the women's camp here, the men's there, the Theresian family camp there, the gypsy camp there. They found each other in October 1944, 2 days after Magda arrived there. Magda was only meant to be there in transit. She was put into a family camp part of Birkenau, and all those people in there were going to be shipped out somewhere else. But Sibi was told she was there. Another prisoner who had been walking past recognized Magda. She went, and this is the guts of Sibi. Oh my gosh, I wish I could have met this woman. I'm backtracking a little bit. I'm trying to write about these women I'm meeting in their 90s and work out what they were like as teenage girls. I thought would be a huge challenge. In reality, it wasn't, because they're just the same. I don't know if you change. I'd like to think I have. I can tell you 95-year-old Livy is still very much, I'm the baby of the family and everybody look at me and everybody do what I say at 95. Magda is still the thoughtful, the considerate, the softly spoken, always thinks about what she's going to say before she does. And I had Sibi described to me as she was this lion of a person or lioness. She was the tough one. She took it up to the block leaders, to the capos, to the SS. And you'll read about some of what she got up to in the book. So for her, knowing her sister was in Birkenau, she wasn't going to let anything stand in her way of getting to her. She was able to get her, smuggle her out of that camp into their block, and how they then played out for the next several months. Now, 3 sisters together. It's all written there for you. You heard Elisa mention the Death March. You know, in hindsight, I keep thinking I could have written their story in Survival of the Death March as a book in itself. The Death March for them did not go for days. It did not go for weeks. It went for months. I have got it written up in the detail that the sisters remember, which is pretty damn good, let me say. However, something happened on that Death March, which Magda told me about when I was with them. And I was in January last year, I was actually, so coming up, gosh. No, it must be January last year, just before the world went to pot, when Magda just casually said, I remember writing a diary on the Death March. And her daughters, you know, when I talk about the kids, they're people my age, and they went, what are you talking about? And even Livy said, I don't remember that. And she said, I did. Everyone asked the question, well, where is it? And she said, I have no idea. I did ask them to look for it, and they did a bit of a look and said they couldn't find it. About, 3 weeks before the book went to the printers, I get a frantic call from Israel. We've found Magda's diary. This is a document written by Magda 77 years ago, when she was on that death march being moved from one concentration camp to another. She went into the administration building for some reason, and she stole a notebook and some pens. And we have some 80 pages of this beautiful handwritten day-by-day recording of what was going on for those girls on that death march. The date, the names of the villages. Was it the Russians threatening them or the Germans? Who was fighting the conflict? The bombings going on overhead. How they were hiding out. Because they, on the death march, just backing up a little bit, after, gosh, that was January they left. So it was about the 30th of April, they were still being marched between camps. And that was the day that they decided enough was enough was enough. And Sibby and the girls and several other young girls, while on another march to another camp, timed it for when they could see a deep ditch running alongside the road they were walking down, to go to the nearest SS guard beside them and say to him, "We're leaving. See that forest? We're going there now." He pointed his rifle at them and said, "I'll shoot you." And Sibby said, "Then you shoot us all." And these girls turned and walked away from that death march. They immediately just jumped into the ditch and hid there while the rest of the march went past, because there's still a lot of SS to go past them. And then when safe, ran into the forest, and then spent the next 2 months in these villages in Germany. They were in Germany by this part, they were out of Poland. Incredible things that she's written. There's one extract we snuck into the back of the book. It is what, I'm not sure if you got an actual copy of the book there, or there were some advanced reader copies went out, but it wasn't in. We got it into the final published book. It's the comment that Magda wrote on the 8th of May, 1945, as she and the girls had just been told by the Russian soldiers going past them that the war was over. And at midnight on that day, the 8th of May, she wrote what hearing that meant to her. And I get goosebumps, and I'm not even reading it now because I know what it says. That is one extract from this incredible diary, of which what becomes of it will now be debated and decided with the family in due course. So we've got them on the death march. They do eventually get to displaced persons camp. They get to safety. Livy and Magda still chortle because Sibby's not here for them to have a go at her at anymore. When they arrived at this huge big displaced persons camp that had been divided by the Allies into the Americans, the British and the Soviets, they all had their camps. The first people they met, by the way, were the American army, and they tried to talk to them and they couldn't. They spoke Russian and German and other languages, but clearly not English. And so this American soldier went and got one of the people from the Soviet area, and they came over and spoke to the girls, and then they were offered the choice. Do you want to stay here in the American camp? This is where you've arrived. Or do you want to go with this soldier and go to the Russian camp? They went, Sibby said, we'll go with the Russians because we can talk to them. I don't know how many decades after that they may or may not have regretted that, because their life then, took another turn, didn't it? From the displaced person camps, they were all gathered and rounded up, and when they had all these people from Czechoslovakia together, they got buses to return them back to Czechoslovakia. Now, in telling you about their return home, I'm also going to tell you about one of the challenges I have writing stories. I don't have them too often. I'm pretty good when I'm writing these horrific, evil things to disassociate myself from the words I'm putting on the screen. I type away, I'm unemotional, they're words on a screen for me. Not so much when I read them back. I can't edit my own work because I can't read my own work. Only then does the impact of what I've been writing hit me, and it becomes very, very difficult for me. I'm very lucky that I have incredible publishers and editors in London and in New York who then help me bring these stories together. But there was one thing Well, the thing to remember here, or to know here, before my manuscript went anywhere, other than to one main editor in London, it got sent to the families in Israel, 3 generations of adults. And they were asked, you must go through this and you've got to tell me where I've gone wrong, what I've made mistakes in, what you want me to alter, what you want me to add to. Here's your chance. And they were given a good period of time to get back to me with comments. I said to them, hey, listen, guys, this has not gone through all those fancy editors that are going to be looking for typos and spelling and grammar checkers. That's down the track. So don't worry about that. I'm a lazy writer. If it's not spelt right, I know it's going to get picked up by other people way smarter than I am. Still, 2 members of the family couldn't help themselves and sent me back pages and pages of, there should have been a comma on page 22 after this, and you've spelt this wrong. So it was quite lovely, and I appreciate their efforts. I did send them on. And everything I had written in that story, only one comment came back that needed changing. And it came from Livy and Magda, who said to me, you're writing about our return to Prague. You have got so wrong. You have to change it. Let me explain again. It's a spoiler, but it's not a spoiler. When they returned to Prague, these 5 busloads of young Holocaust survivors, as they were entering into Prague, and for those of you who've been there, you know, you go over the Child's Bridge and then through the streets into Wenceslas Square. I can never say that word nicely. It doesn't roll off the tongue for me. Those buses, as they came into Prague, the streets were lined with people, several deep, for kilometres, or miles in your terms. They were throwing flowers onto the buses. They were crying. People were clapping and cheering. They forced the buses to stop every now and then, and people would clamber on board and press food and money into the hands of these young girls and boys. And then they arrived in the square and they were taken out, and they think it was the mayor. I've called him the mayor. They really have no idea who the official was. But there was an official there who made an official, welcome and spoke to them before they were then taken and housed to be relocated around Czechoslovakia. When I was writing that, for some reason, that got to me and I got angry. And I wrote those scenes. I call them scenes because I learned how to write scripts, by the way, not novels. I've never learned how to write a novel. But when I was writing those scenes, I let my anger play out. For me, it was a matter of, who the heck do these people think they are? How dare they think they can line the streets and clap and throw flowers and press money into the hands of these girls and boys when they've been responsible for sending them away in the first place? When they're responsible for them no longer having families and homes to come back to. And so I wrote all those scenes about their coming back to Prague in a very angry tone. Only to then hear from Livy and Magda, that was the happiest day of our life. We came home. We came home. I got it wrong. I rewrote it. I think I may have left a little snipe in there from Civi. I couldn't resist it, but the girls passed it on a second reading. So there's an element of writing true stories when, as a writer, you've got to remember that it's not your story and tell the story you're being asked to. As we mentioned, they got back to Slovakia. Their home now had other people living in it. And if you look at the photos in the back of the book, you'll see a photo there of Magda holding some candlesticks. Look at the photo first, and then you'll read the significance of those candlesticks when they returned home to Vranov, their home town. They tried to resettle in Bratislava. That's where all the displaced survivors came to, because none of the towns or villages in Slovakia were welcoming any of them back. But even Bratislava didn't. They were still second-class citizens, denied work, denied housing. Civi, well, she fell in love. She married and had a baby. Livy, the baby of the family, the youngest, all of a sudden there's a shift in, shall we say, the power between the sisters, as the youngest now becomes the one dictating how they're going to live their lives and where they're going to live their lives. She and Magda followed in what had been Sibi's footsteps several years earlier and joined a Hashara group to go into the forests of Czechoslovakia and train for 3 months in survival techniques. When Livy was telling me about that, she's kind of chortling away and going, they said we had to do this 3 months of survival training in the forest in Slovakia before we could then go to Israel. She said, 3 months? We survived 3 years, but still we had to do the 3 months training. From that training, that group of young men and women was smuggled through now communist-controlled Slovakia to the Romanian border, smuggled through there to get to the Black Sea and onto a boat and step off that boat in Haifa. At that pivotal point in history when the nation state of Israel was being created. 3 days ago, I got a message and some pictures from Livy's daughter in Israel, who, by the way, the family's now trying to research everything they can about not only their mums and their dads, they all married Holocaust survivors as well, but also that period in history. And I got this message from Dorrit saying, look what I found. She's found in archives the ship's log that Livy and Magda were on. And we now know they arrived in Israel, in Haifa, on the 29th of February, 1949. There was one other person on that boat. And that man who Livy and he only exchanged glances at, never spoke, a couple of years later met each other and they subsequently married. Livy's husband was also on that boat coming. It was called the Transylvania. Sibi and her husband made it to Israel about 6 months later with their baby. They had to take a different route, mostly overland, to get to Greece and come through that way. But what I'm able to tell you, and I'll just say really briefly in the next 5 minutes before I hope somebody will either send a question on the chat line or ask a question, or I'll just keep talking. I can do this. Their time in Israel in those early years, being able to tell that from the perspective of young girls and boys, I'm told is fairly unique. There are not too many stories not written by the academics and the historians, the United Nations, the military, that talk about the creation of Israel from that perspective. Magda and Livy in particular, had a very special relationship with a very special person. I think her story and her relationship with this man should be documented. That man, his name was Chaim Weizmann. He was the first president of the state of Israel. She was the maid in the house of President and Vera Weizmann. She and President Weizmann, well, he would say they were more than friends. To him, Livia was the reason they now were living in this country. And he would say to her, they had a shared love of gardening, her and Weizmann. Livy became the flower arranger also in the house of their presidential palace. It's called the presidential palace, it's just a really big home. And often she would be in the garden and Weizmann would come out and get her to sit on one of the bench seats with him and tell her how the soil they're standing on belongs more to her than it did to him. Because she had suffered and she had fought and she had the right to be there, he said, more than he did. You all probably know he spent most of the war, he was in London. Vera Weizmann, who took Livy under her wing, guided her in the ways of romance. And whenever she worked late at night, because they had a special function in that house, Vera Weizmann always made the president's driver, chauffeur, take Livy home in his limousine. That limousine, by the way, is in a glass building at the Weizmann house in Rehovot, just out of Israel, out of Tel Aviv. It's still there, that same limousine there that she used to get driven home to. Driven from the presidential palace to her home that she was sharing with her husband, which was a goat shed. A farmer kicked his goats out, and that's where they moved into as newlyweds. She said when they lay down at night time, Ziggy, her husband, his feet hung out the door because it wasn't quite big enough for him. So that incredible relationship, not only was it with Wiseman, by the way, Ben-Gurion, who, being the prime minister at the time, based primarily in Jerusalem. Wiseman was sick. In fact, he died in that house while Libby was working for him. So he never really went much up to Jerusalem. So the parliament and the prime minister used to have to come to him. Whenever Ben-Gurion came to see President Wiseman, which was every week, every other week, he would immediately seek out Livy in that house, take her arm and kiss her numbers. He too just had this connection with this young girl, so strong. Every visiting dignitary from around the world, Helen Keller, who came to visit Wiseman, he always insisted they had to meet Livy. Helen Keller took her hand and her assistant translated a message that Helen Keller tapped out onto Livy's hand. Henry Ford was the person who brought that beautiful limousine and donated it. The photo in the back of Livy as a bride standing with her husband Ziggy. The third person in that photo is the First Lady of Israel, Vera Wiseman, who insisted on being at their wedding and who Livy remained friends with up until she also died. Both President Wiseman and Vera Wiseman are buried in the grounds of their home, and Livy every now and then sneaks in, and one of the guides there, because they have guided tours there, sees her and just steps back and say, Livy, why don't you tell these people who have come to hear about this place about it? That's the story of the girls in very bullet point. Of course, there's so much more intertwined with it. Are there any questions you've got there, Nicole, or does anyone want to ask a question? Or I can just keep talking about them and their families and the significance of memory, the significance of secrets. Do we have any questions, or do you want me to just keep going?
No, we do have a question. Someone's asking, because you're telling difficult stories, does the writing process exhaust or energize you?
Energizes me while I'm doing it, and then when I stop, and I tend to write at night after it's dark. I'm not necessarily a procrastinator, but I'm easily distracted. So if somebody walks past me, and I just saw my son walk past me a minute ago because I'm actually up in his home in Brisbane, I'll go off and chat. My daughter would ring me up and say, hey, do you want to go shopping? Yeah, sure, count me in. A bird flies past the window, I want to look at it and wonder where it's going. So I tend to do my writing from about 9 at night till 3 in the morning, and I'm fired up. And then I collapse. I actually can't go to bed for about an hour afterwards because, yes, it is exhausting, because I'll sneakily read what I've written and get quite emotional about it. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I do know how to self-care. I worked in the social work department in a hospital for 20 years. I know of the significance of self-care and protecting myself. I know that everything I hear, I read, I write, every pain, every trauma, every bit of guilt, is not mine. I have no right to even think I can own any part of it. And so that's how I manage, by reminding myself, not yours.
That's wonderful.
I actually have a question. You just started to touch on the different themes in the book. So if you were to give us some takeaways from the book, what would they be? What was your purpose in writing the book, and what would you like us to take away?
One of the things I think that's important to remember here is the difference between history and memory. They are two very different things. Academics and historians will record for us to learn about history. The memory of those people who were there, that is what I like to record. And if those memories are flawed, they're not fully together because bits are forgotten, what does it matter? I mean, you possibly know as well as I do that I was told by a rabbi in Sydney, gosh, I hope he was right, that in Hebrew there is no word for history. All our memories, all our stories must come from the memories of those people who witnessed and experienced them. So when I do get criticized, and I do, not by any member of the Jewish community in any country I've been to, but there are critics out there all the same. This does not tally with the documented history, the academic research. I've tried to find out how much of that academic research has been done by anybody that was there. I struggle to find that. So memory, frail or not, is real. But here's where memory also differs. Livy and Sibby were in Auschwitz-Birkenau for 2.5 years before Magda joined them, together, every day and every night. Their recollection of what they lived through and what they saw differs many, many times. Their interpretation of what they were seeing differs, and they were seeing the same thing. And every Holocaust survivor I've met who say to me, thank you for telling the story of Lali and Gita and telling their story, you've told mine. Mine is the same, but it's different. I put it down, the difference between the sisters, because when I was looking at that, I went, okay, this is just crazy that we've got these differing memories. Then I realized one was 15 and one was 19. The maturity and extra education. Livy had her education stopped at 13, so Magda, hers at 17. So that played a part on how what they were witnessing and experiencing was then internalized and remembered. So go with the memory. But there were also elements of these girls' survival which they kept from their families that are now revealed and that they kept from each other. Magda, I think still to this day at 97, she struggles with the fact that for 2.5 years she slept in her own bed with her mother and her grandfather. And only when she joined her sisters did she realise what they had endured. And so of course that's going to be something that she has to deal with. Livy and Sibby don't have an issue with it, never did from day one. But them, it was just, they were just glad that one of them was not enduring the evil they were. But you know, that kind of guilt, it just doesn't go away. There is I think it's on YouTube, I have a little video. We've made several videos of particularly Livy talking because she has good English. And I got her to record something on film and we've got it out on YouTube because she said it to me one day when I was talking to her. She just casually said to me, I lie down in my bed in Israel every night and I fall asleep in Birkenau. Yeah, all these years later. And it looks, we've got a little snippet of her saying that, and it just horrifies me that this beautiful woman still will live out her days like that. But I can also tell you that she has the giggle of a schoolgirl, and her laughter is something to delight in, and that's something that she does every single day. There's a book, it was written by a New Zealand author, I think it's sold in America. It's a children's book called The Wonky Donkey. It's a very funny little book for 2 to 3 year olds. I sent a copy of it to Livy to read to her great-grandsons. And I have the most incredible photos of her reading this book. She and this boy, and one little boy in particular is 4, to say they are absolutely cacking themselves, we say in Australia, as they read this incredible book. Yes, it's affected their lives. How could it not? But it hasn't determined the life that they lived. They have had very happy lives. And hey, there's 4 generations of them now. That's a pretty damn good legacy. Hitler never got to do anything about that. There were other stories that came out when I started doing research, because I say to them, I'm going to do some research into your background in Slovakia. Because they can't remember a lot of that. They were girls. And they encouraged me to, please, we don't know our family history back there. And so I have a researcher. She lives in Lully's hometown of Krumpaki. There's a little village about an hour out of Koshita. And I'm an honorary Krumpakian. I love to go to Slovakia, and I go back to Krumpaki, to Lully's hometown, and the mayor sends the driver to get me, and the whole town puts on a concert for me in this beautiful little town. But this lady there called Lenka, who teaches English in the town. She's Slovakian, but she teaches English, so she helps me with my translations. And when she could finally leave from Krumpaki and go to Brunov, because COVID denied her going there for most of the first year I was writing, and she got in there, and the Slovakian authorities, because I've written about Lali and Gita and about Silka, Slovakian young girls and boys, and now the sisters, they're very generous in giving me access to documents that I really shouldn't see. I'm talking about births, deaths, and marriages, these things, these personal family documents. But in each of these little towns, just like Silka's hometown, Bartishov opened up the journals recording her and generations of her family's life. I think I know more about Silka's family than she did, because I went back many generations after her, researching her. But when Lenka got to Brunov and was sitting there, and I'm back in Melbourne and she's in Slovakia, and she rings me up because it's nighttime for me, day for her. She said, look, I'm here at the office and I've got the journals, and you've given me the girls' names, you've given me their dates of birth. I found Sibby's, and we started with her, the eldest. She said there's a slight spelling difference in her name. And I found Magda. She said, but I can't find Livy. Where's Livy? Have you got her date of birth right? And I said, well, it's what she gave me. So she said, oh, okay, look, I'll ring you back. And so about 15 minutes later, she rings me back and she said, we found her. She's actually a year older than she thinks she is. She had given me her date of birth as 1926. She is written in this journal in 1925, the exact same day and month though. So she's a year older than she thought she was, poor love. Mind you, she took it all very well when I told her. She said, oh, she's my age, I'll take it. And so she had that, but then she said to me, the mother's name is the same, the father's name is the same, I've got the day and the month the same, the year's out, but it's not her name. So she told me what the name was written down in this journal. These are big journals that date back hundreds of years, all handwritten. They hadn't computerized this stuff yet in Slovakia. So I had to ring up Livy, and I had with her and her daughter Dorrit on the phone. I went, hey, Livy, you got another name? And she said, well, people call me Livia, or my family and you, because she wants to adopt me, but I'm not letting her at this point in time. She said, you just call me Livy. And I said, I know, but do you have another name? And she said, oh, I don't know. Why? I said, if I say the name Esther to you, does it mean anything? And she goes, oh, yes, that's my name. At which point her daughter went, what are you talking about? I said, well, I can tell you that Esther Haya Mella was born on this day. And she said, oh, yes, that's me. So uncovering these secrets. But you know what? That wasn't the only secret we uncovered that day. We also, by the way, found her dad's death certificate and details. We now know the exact date and place, and I know exactly where he's buried in Koshita, and all this information. But then Lenka rang me back half an hour later, and she said, well, do you want to know about the fourth sister? I went, there's no fourth sister. She said, yes, there is. But tell me what you've got. And she then told me about another birth registration she was looking at. And it was for a little girl who was born 3 months after their father died. His name is on her birth certificate, but of course with the letters ZL following it, indicating his past. She said she was born Amelia 3 months later. And I said, I've never mentioned her. She said, I'll get back to you. And I said, well, do what I always do when I find I get dead ends with birth details. Go and have a look in the death certificates. Go and look in the death register. And she rang me back later to say she died at age 3 from tuberculosis. So I then asked Livy, and I said to Dorrit, this is what I found out, this is her daughter. Do you want to ask your mother about her sister? And I was on the WhatsApp video with them, and she asked her, and she said, yes, that was our baby sister. And her daughter said to her, you've never mentioned her. Have you forgotten about her? She said, never. Magda and I talk about her every day. She was our baby. But you know, I hadn't shared that. And why should they? We're all allowed our secrets. Have we got any more questions here, Nicole?
Debbie, I think you said you had a question.
I was just feeling like torn because I can't wait to read the book. I'm sorry to say I haven't read it. I'm amazed that 70 years later, we're still discovering new stories and new aspects of the story, because I learned things from you today that I didn't know, that it was possible to write a journal during a death march. That's a mind-blowing thing. So we're still learning new things, and that's great that we're still uncovering new aspects of the Holocaust. And yet these people are 95 and 97 years old, and pretty soon they're going to be gone. And do you feel this urgency to write more, to find out more stories, or to encourage other writers to write them down quickly, because pretty soon we just won't have them?
Well, absolutely. There's two parts to that. There are a lot of stories coming out in the last 3 or 4 years.
Yeah.
With the word Auschwitz in the title. Publishers in London said that somebody there had said to them that the Tattooist of Auschwitz had created a new subgenre of historical fiction called Holocaust fiction. And that's great. That's fantastic. But here's the other amazing thing, or the wonderful thing. Thank you, Steven Spielberg, for the 55,000 videotapes that you hold, probably in a vault somewhere. So they are recorded. How they play out in the next decades to come, I don't know. That's up to Spielberg and the Shoah Foundation people. I'd like to think that they will be made more readily available to authors to look at, with consideration of writing them in the style that I write them. By writing them as in a fictionalized style, I'm told they become relatable, particularly to young people. They can relate to a 15-year-old. If you're a 15-year-old reading about Libby, who was a 15-year-old, what she survived.
Is there a danger in romanticizing the stories to the extent that people actually, I don't want to say forget the history, but are able to compartmentalize the horrible history and just look at these heroic survivors and all of their little personal, their personalities? They become attractive characters.
That's the challenge, Debbie. That's the challenge for me and every other writer who wants to tell these stories. You have got to write them to be able to get the tone and the history in it, while still making it a book that the person reading it will turn the page. That's the challenge. I don't want to romanticize. I know Lully's story was a romantic story. It was about romantic love, but it was real and it happened. I couldn't get away from that. The Sisters is not a story, it's a love story, but it's a love story of the unconditional love of siblings. It's not a love story. You've got to have the horror, the evil, but to be able to have that reader want to continue reading, you've got to make it something they relate to. It's a danger. We'll see how it plays out in the next few years as more books are written. Yeah, hey, here's a brilliant thing. And whether or not Lully's story is, I don't think it's considered a romance novel in any sense of the word. But in Australia, can I tell you that the Australian Education Department has now put it on the school curriculum. Every 13 and 14-year-old girl and boy in Australia are going to learn about the Holocaust, even that little tiny bit, by reading Lully's story. I travel to schools, I talk to schools all around the UK, Australia and New Zealand. I've done a lot of work with the Education Board, spent 2 days with them up in Sydney, recording videos, being interviewed, talking to not only the students, but to the teachers who are going to be working with them as they read the book. So there are many, many podcasts and videos I've done, and at least the kids in Australia and New Zealand, I've got them on the right track. Come on, guys.
Come over here.
We need you here.
Because we actually put out here in Australia a different edition. We call it the YA edition, the young adult edition. There's nothing really changed in it, but we put extra material in it. I put a couple of little letters from me, and we wrote notes for teachers, notes for students. And we do have what's called a YA edition here and in the UK. And I'm on at HarperCollins. And come on, Sarah Nelson, if you're listening to this, get that YA edition out there and start working on your education boards.
That's brilliant.
Does anybody want to jump in before we wrap up for the evening? Anyone out there? Let's ask you this. What's next for you, Heather? What are you working on next? And when will that be coming out?
I work on traveling around many, many countries, talking to people in person like I am with you.
Mm-hmm.
I do book tours every time a book comes out. The first two, Lily and Silkers, I felt that they were, look, I'm getting old, okay? You can't just take me and land me in Prague in the morning, throw me on Prague TV in the middle of the morning, get me at a bookshop signing books in the afternoon, have me talking in the evening, and then I wake up the next day in Budapest, repeat. Next day, hey, I'm in Vienna, repeat. And I said, I want this next book tour, and it includes your country too, of course, where I can take some time out to get to spend with people, not just in such a rushed mode. I was in New York one day and they sent me to Boston. I did a thing in the afternoon. I did a thing in the evening. Early the next morning, I flew to Chicago television in the morning. I did a thing in Chicago that night. I didn't even get to sleep in Chicago because they flew me to Toronto.
Wow.
I want to enjoy what I've written, and I want to enjoy it with people in front of me. So an extended book tour of the US and Europe. Probably have to throw South Africa in there because it's #1 in South Africa for about the 3rd week in a row. But yes, thank you. There is something else which we're going to start working on, but I want to slow it down. I'm going to not do a book a year. That'll probably be 2 years. Historical fiction, of course. Hey, I don't know how to write a story. I haven't got the brain to create something of my own. I'm pretty good at just finding a snippet of real people, real events, and then creating around them. So also Second World War, but in a different theatre of war, not Europe. Think the Pacific, think Asia. That's all I'm going to tell you. And it's going to be about women also. Can I say nurses?
Sounds exciting. Well, I want to thank you for joining us, and I would love to welcome you back here in person when that book is out there. Thank you. It was lovely meeting you, and we so enjoyed having you, and enjoyed the rest of your day. And thank you, everyone.